Chapter 6 of Optimism Bias. Crocuses popping up through the snow. When things go wrong, depression, interpretation, and genes. Consider the story of two young men, Shaw and Fred. Shaw lives in Seattle with his girlfriend Phoebe and their dog, Mr. Cat. Fred lives about 3,000 miles away in a condo in Florida with his wife Sabrina. Life is pleasant for Sean and Fred, both successful corporate lawyers, healthy and happy in their relationships. One day in October, the two fly out to Paris for a business meeting. This is not an unusual event. Fred and Sean travel often. A week later, they return home, excited to reunite with their loved ones. When Sean enters his lakeside house, however, something feels different. He soon notices things are missing. Phoebe's wardrobe is wide open and her clothes are gone. He frantically walks around the house only to find her books, her shoes, and her DVDs and her camera are also missing. Everything's gone except for Mr. Cat, who is on the sofa looking sad and confused. By way of coincidence, Fred arrives in his condo and finds a similar scenario. On the sofa, instead of Mr. Cat, he discovers a letter from Sabrina, the type of farewell letter you find in soppy films. Needless to say, both men are distraught. The people they cared for the most, and they have done the most in these two men previously imagined to look in a place only on daytime TV. For the next couple of weeks, they are enveloped in misery. They find it difficult to eat, sleep, or work, and they lose interest in social interaction and physical activity. They stay in bed, going over events again and again in their minds, ruminating about what they went wrong and what they could have done differently. What would have happened if they never had left for Paris? The thoughts spiral in their mind in an exhausting manner. Sean's and Fred's reactions are normal. People find loss painful. We also find failure, rejection, abandonment, and change difficult to deal with. Sean and Fred experienced all of the above, and their situations made me particularly distressing by the fact that they had no apparent control over the outcome. Temporary sadness, inaction, and even hopelessness are to be expected in such cases. The behaviors they exhibit, loss of interest in previously rewarding activities, sleep disruption, weight loss, difficulty concentrating, low mood, and negative thoughts, are all symptoms of depression. Some psychologists argue that these reactions have an adaptive function. We temporarily retreat in our own world, focusing on our mental energies on processing the painful events so we can heal. We examine our behavior, the actions of others, and the circumstances that led to the specific outcome until we can make sense of it all. It is time out on life, similar to the rest required when fighting a cold. When we catch a cold, most of us stay in bed for a day or two, drinking tea and chicken soup, until our immune system effectively fights it off. Some, however, will develop complications. People who are prone to develop severe problems from the common cold are individuals with weak immune systems, such as the elderly, pregnant women, and people with pre-existing medical conditions. The rest will successfully fight it off and return to normal health. Similarly, all of us will experience loss and adversity at some point, and most will initially react like Sean and Fred. However, the majority of people will eventually heal from disappointment and heartache. Occasionally, adversity will trigger a prolonged negative mental state, which may be the beginning of clinical depression. This will occur in approximately 15% of the population over their time. Often, depressive episodes can be traced back to a specific stressful event in a person's life, but not always. After a period of processing and rumination, will Sean and Fred become stronger or weaker? What will they have learned? How will they perceive their past, their future, and their role what occurred? Here the two men diverge. Fred blames himself for what happened. He concludes that he was demanding and inflexible in his relationship with Sabrina. He begins to believe that his high expectations will forever interfere with his relationships. He thinks his life is doomed and that his inability to compromise will not only destroy his romantic relationships, but will also make him a poor lawyer, and when the time comes, an inadequate father. Fred's manner of interpretation of the event is known as pessimistic explanatory style. He holds himself responsible for the negative events. I drove her away. And he believes that the situation is permanent. All my relationships are doomed, and there's nothing I can do about it. He explorates from specific failure to other life domains. I'm not only a terrible partner, but a poor lawyer and a friend. Fred thinks negative events are inevitable in his life because of what he considers to be problematic personality traits. His current inability to mend his relationship with Sabrina grows into a general hopelessness about the future. Fred supposes that the failure of his marriage indicates he will fail in all future romances. He becomes pessimistic, expecting the worst. Sean has a very different interpretation of the situation. Yes, he and Phoebe did not always see eye to eye. Yes, he has made mistakes, but he is human. He doesn't want to stumble once in a while. Who doesn't stumble once in a while? Ultimately, it was Phoebe's weakness, her inability to deal with conflict, her insecurities, that made her run away rather than deal with the reality. He will need to seek a stronger, more trustworthy partner. Sean uses this known as optimistic explanatory style. He sees others as causing the adverse situation. Phoebe is weak and hysterical. Believes his circumstances will change. I will find another partner. And does not globalize the failure in his personal life to other domains. I'm a successful lawyer. Because Sean views Phoebe's departure as an isolated event, one that has no bearing on future relationships or other social and professional interactions, he is hopeful. He may have been unable to stop Phoebe from leaving, but that doesn't mean he has no control over future relationships. To the contrary, he believes that he learned an important lesson. He is optimistic that as long as he steers clear of the Phoebes of the world, he will be fine. Of course, neither Fred's nor Sean's interpretation of the event will fully align with reality. Most likely, both had some role in the breakdown of the relationships. Probably both will go on to make some of the same mistakes in the future. Sean, however, is more likely to overcome his misery, go back to functioning as before, and eventually find a new love. Fred will find it more difficult to move on. Research shows that he has a higher probability of developing depression. Numerous studies demonstrate that pessimistic explanatory style, like Fred's, is a risk factor for clinical depression. Depressed individuals are also more likely to view negative events as their fault, permanent and encompassing all aspects of their life. The crucial element that links depressive symptoms with the pessimistic explanatory style is expectation. A pessimistic explanatory style triggers depression by producing negative predictions for the future, which promote negative mood, passiveness, and hopelessness. Shock, shock, shock. The notion of optimistic and pessimistic explanatory styles was put forward by psychologist Martin Seligman developed the concept while trying to explain the results of a study he had conducted a decade earlier. In the mid-1960s, Seligman was a young researcher studying animal learning at the University of Pennsylvania. He wanted to examine whether dogs could learn to avoid an adverse situation if they had prior warning. The idea was simple. First, he would teach the dogs a certain auditory tone that would be followed by an electric shock. Then he would give the dogs an option to escape the shocks by running over a barrier. After the tone was presented, would they learn to do so? Before I reveal the results of Seligman's now famous study, let's engage in the short mental exercise. Imagine yourself sitting at the center of an empty room. The walls are bare, no paintings, no plants, not even a window. The chair you were sitting on is the only piece of furniture around. Suddenly, out of nowhere, you experience a strong electrical shock. The high currents run through your skin, muscle, and hair. Only moments later, another shock is administered, then another and another. I need to get out of here, you say to yourself, and try the door. Locked. Air shaft too small. Jump on the chair. Shocked. Get off the chair. Shock, shock, shock. There is no way out of there, and nothing you do seems to stop the pain. The shocks continue whether you bang on the wall, stand on your head, or lie on the floor. You sit on the chair feeling terrified and miserable. A couple of hours later, for no apparent reason, the shocks cease, and the door cracks open. You sigh in relief and run out. Euphoria, however, short-lived. The next day, to your horror, you find yourself alone in another unfamiliar room. It is not the same room. One has paintings on the walls and a gray carpet on the floor. But sure enough, within minutes, dreadful electric shocks start. What do you do? You think of a response a few moments while you return to Sligman's dogs. As you recall, Sligman wanted to see if his dogs would be able to escape electric shocks, like the ones you have just imagined. After learning that they were predicted by a warning tone, he first put the dogs in harnesses and presented a tone followed by a shock, then another tone followed by a shock, and then another. Soon enough, the dogs would whine whenever they heard the tone, indicating they knew that a shock was coming. While harnessed, the dogs could not do anything to escape the shocks. Next, Sligman took the dogs out of their harnesses and put them in a box with a low barrier that they could easily leap over. He presented the tone, but too surprised, the dogs did nothing. They did not attempt to jump out. They simply lay on the floor howling. Sligman knew the dogs had learned to anticipate the shock when they heard the tone. Then why were they not escaping when the warning sign was presented? There was a clue that was going on. Only the dogs had previously been put in a harness acted passively. Dogs that had never been put in harnesses quickly learned to jump over the barrier to avoid the shocks. It seemed like the dogs that had been in the harness before assumed that once again no control over adverse outcomes, even though they were put in a new environment, one from they could escape the pain. They did not even try. There were certain aspects of the dog's behavior that resembled a well-known human condition. The dog's passiveness, lack of assertiveness and exploration, negative mood, whining, and general helplessness reminded Seligman of patients suffering from depression. The animals who also ate less and lost weight, just as depressed patients do. These similarities made Seligman wonder whether clinical depression is caused by perception absence of control over outcomes. People with depression, he hypothesized, learn from past experience to behave helplessly. Therefore, even in situations where negative outcomes are avoidable and positive ones attainable, they do not attempt to shape their destiny and thus are less likely to shun harm and achieve desirable results. This in turn feeds their depression further. Seligman named his theory learned helplessness theory, which ultimately became a dominant model of depression. Now let's return to that dreadful shock room. Imagine once again that you are there. You are standing alone in the gray carpet, yet another shock is administered. You feel the electricity traveling through your body. What do? Do you wait until the shock stops, or do you search for the escape route? In our hypothetical scenario, most people would certainly attempt to find a way out of the first room. However, would they try to escape the second, or would they assume the room number 2, like the room number 1, that yet again the door would be shut and the air shaft would be too small to allow escape? Would they learn to become helpless and not even try to avoid the shocks? The answer would vary from person to person. As it turns out, it would also vary from dog to dog. In Seligman's experiment, not all dogs learned to be helpless. Not all dogs showed depressive symptoms. A minority of the dogs had previously received shocks while harnessed, went on happily to jump over the barrier to avoid the shocks when given the opportunity. The dogs expressed individual differences like humans do. Just as some dogs did not learn to be helpless, some humans, like our friend Sean, will experience severe blows, the death of a loved one, sickness, unemployment, bankruptcy, heartache, and yet put the pieces of their shattered lives together and move on. If Sean were a dog in Seligman's experiment, he would probably be the first to leap out of the shock box. He would not assume a certain situation in which he found himself would apply to all others. On the other end of the spectrum, we found a small number of dogs that act helplessly even without prior exposure to uncontrollable shocks. As you may recall, Seligman observed that most dogs had not experienced unavoidable shocks in harness, would be able to leap out of the shock box after the first couple of shocks. However, he found that 5% of the dogs would not. They acted helplessly and took the pain for no apparent reason, a passive response that resembled the behavior of individuals who are vulnerable to depression, people like Fred. Seligman believes that people who think like Fred can learn to think like Sean, that an optimistic explanatory style can be taught and implemented, even in the individuals who are prone to interpret the world in a pessimistic manner. To do so, Fred would first be required to identify the adverse event that's easy, Sabrina's sudden departure, in his interpretation of the unbearable personality, and the consequences of his interpretation. I feel miserable and helpless. I am no longer productive at work. When Fred would need to consider the evidence in support of it or against his interpretation. I have many good friends who love me. I get along with them quite well. That must mean my personality is not that bad. And think of other explanations for why things went wrong. Sabrina had different goals in life. We did not communicate well. Finally, Fred would have to reconsider the implications of the breakup. Sabrina's leaving does not necessarily mean I will die poor and alone, and consider the benefits of moving on from the failed relationship. Once Fred successfully follows these steps, a new hope might arise. There is evidence that altering a person's cognitive style by using training and talk therapy reduces the likelihood of suffering from depression and enhances physical health. For example, one study, Seligman identified a group of college students with a pessimistic explanatory style. He then conducted training sessions with half the students, offering them techniques for adapting an optimistic explanatory style. The other students, the control group, were not given training. Months later, students who had received training had fewer self-reported symptoms of physical illness and fewer doctor visits than students in the control group. The number of tennis balls. Cognitive therapy is one route Fred might choose to take in order to battle his growing depression. In addition to, or as an alternative, he might decide to use antidepressant medication. If he was to choose antidepressants, he would not be alone. About 27 million Americans take these drugs. What Fred might not be aware of is that antidepressants would ultimately change the way he thinks, the way he processes and interprets the world around him in a very similar manner to cognitive therapy such as Seligman's learned optimism training. How do antidepressants alter a person's perception? The most commonly prescribed antidepressants are drugs that enhance the function of the neurotransmitter serotonin. A neurotransmitter is a chemical that enables communication between neurons in the brain. It is released into the space between two neurons, known as a synaptic cleft, by one neuron and binds the receptors of the receiving neuron. You can imagine the neurons as two kids playing tennis, and the neuron transmitter as the ball. One kid, William, is serving to the other side, Henry. In cases when the ball does not reach Henry's side of the court, William will run and grab the ball back and serve again. The majority of antidepressants, such as Prozac, are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. What does SSRIs do? In this parallel universe, inhibit William's desire to go get the balls back, inhibit what is known as reuptake. Instead, William will take another tennis ball from his bag when it is his turn to serve. As a result, more tennis balls will be floating around on the court between William and Henry. Some of the balls will eventually reach Henry, and he will pick them up and put them in his bag. Back to the brain. As a result of taking SSRIs, the level of serotonin in the synaptic cleft is increased, and there will be more serotonin available for binding with the receptors of the postsynaptic neuron, or Henry. The drugs are selective because they predominantly affect the function of serotonin rather than other neurotransmitters such as dopamine or noradrenaline. Don't get me wrong, depression is not caused by a malfunction of a single neurotransmitter. On the contrary, both dopamine and noradrenaline play an important role in depression, And some drugs do indeed target their function, but these are less commonly prescribed than SSRIs. Dopamine and its involvement in expectations of reward are discussed at length in Chapter 8. Many people assume that antidepressants directly affect a person's mood. Pop one in and you magically become happy. This is not the case. Here is what you will need. You will not find an information leaflet for Prozac. Rather than altering an individual's mood, what antidepressants do is change cognitive biases. People with propensity for depression tend to be biased towards negative stimuli. When they walk into a crowded party, they will orient towards individuals with fearful or angry expressions. Later, they will remember negative social interactions, spilling red wine on someone's white dress, better than positive ones, having an interesting conversation with a woman wearing the stained white dress. They will also clarify ambiguous interactions as negative. She was not genuinely interested in the conversation, she was just being polite. Such negative biases in processing information result in negative interpretation of life experiences, leading to low mood and pessimism. Antidepressants change this pattern. They reinstate positive processing of information. After taking medication, depressed patients start orienting more towards happy faces and other positive stimuli. They also remember them better. At first, this will not enhance their mood, but after a few weeks of processing more of the good and less of the bad and ugly, the world seems more inviting and mood is enhanced. It takes time for changes in perception, attention, and memory to consolidate and alter a person's emotional state. This is particularly why antidepressants are not known to have immediate mood-enhancing effects. It takes a few weeks before depressive symptoms are visibly reduced. Given that most antidepressants work by altering the levels of serotonin in the brain, it may come to no surprise that a paper publishing the prestigious journal Science in 2007 revealed that a gene coding for serotonin production predicted a person's likelihood of suffering from depression. The gene identified is one that encodes the serotonin transporter, which removes serotonin from the systematic cleft or tennis balls from the court. The serotonin transporter gene has alleles, which can come in either long version or short version. An allele is DNA sequence in a particular gene. Which gene has two alleles? Whether someone has two long versions of the serotonin transporter gene allele, two short versions, or one of each will determine the expression and function of the serotonin transporter, and therefore the function of serotonin itself. In individuals with short version of the allele, the serotonin transporter functions less efficiently. Such individuals are also twice as likely to suffer from depression, but only if they have experienced a stressful life event, such as unemployment, divorce, bankruptcy, or health problems. In other words, low efficiency of the serotonin transporter does not directly enhance a person's susceptibility to depression. However, rather it makes a person less resistant to stressors, and therefore it makes it more difficult to overcome life's downturns, such as having a weak immune system. Humans are not the only species that display depressive symptoms in response to adverse events. We saw that earlier. Seligman's dogs reacted depressed as receiving shocks that were out of their control. The association between genes that code for serotonin function and depressive behavior is not uniquely human either. Although Seligman never took saliva from his dogs to test for their genetic makeup, studies show that non-human animals suggest that the relationship between serotonin function and the blue travels away from the evolutionary ladder. As far back as mice, you may think that mice as being very different from our own species. What could a mouse possibly tell you about a condition as complex as depression? A condition that most of us reflects the essence of human fragility. There are many distinctions between mice and men. Mice are smaller, they possess long tails and pointy ears. They are often eaten live by large birds, something that rarely happens to humans. It is difficult to imagine a mouse contemplating the meaning of life or agonizing over lost love. Like humans, however, these mammals are frequently found in the kitchen in the middle of the night searching for leftovers. Regardless of our dissimilarities, mice are the laboratory animals most closely related to humans, to which generic engineering can be applied with relative case. Genetically engineered mice are referred to knockout mice. They have had a gene of turned off by inactivity of specific gene in a group of mice. Scientists can examine how the behavior of these mice differ from those mice that have not been genetically engineered. In this way, the particular process that are mediated by the gene that can be identified. To examine the role of the serotonin transporter gene, the gene was disruptive in a group of mice. At first, the knockout mice did not seem any different from the control mice. Those did not have any genetically engineered. However, after putting the mice in a stressful environment, differences start to emerge. The mice with the disrupted gene showed an enhanced response to stressors. This was observed both behaviorally and psychologically. They were expressed through fearful interaction, and their stress hormone levels were higher. The reason for studying genetically engineered mice is not to learn about these small creatures. Rather, scientists fiddle with the genetics of mice in hope of learning something about humans. Will humans with less efficient serotonin functions also show enhanced psychological response in stressful situations? The answer is yes. Results of a brain imaging study reveals that people with a short version of the allele have higher activation in the amygdala in response to fearful and angry faces, as well as response to negative words such as cancer and disturbing pictures such as those mutilated bodies. Why does the amygdala of people with short alleles overreact in response to stressful events? The amygdala of structure deep in the mind of the processes of emotional stimuli. It is involved in the generating psychosociological responses to these stimuli. The amygdala activity is regulated by parts of the frontal cortex, in particular the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC. In individuals with a short allele of the serotonin transporter gene, there is reduced connectivity between the ACC and the amygdala. This means that the two structures are not as good as communicating with each other. As a result, the ACC is less in reducing fear and stress responses in the amygdala. This is particularly problematic when fear responses which may have called for previously are no longer appropriate. For example, when I put you back in the shock room, you'll probably react with fear and anxiety because you would be expecting electric shocks at any moment. Your pulse would rise, sweat would start to drip from your forehead, and your mind would be hijacked by one thought only: when will the shock arrive? In 10 minutes elapsed and no shocks were delivered, you'd start calming down. An hour later, you'd be completely relaxed, humming away and thinking about what you might have for dinner. This is known as the fear extinction, the process of learning that something that was previously threatening no longer is. Fear extinction involves the regulation of the amygdala activity by the ACC. As the connectivity between these structures is relatively impaired in the carriers of the short allele, these individuals will be less capable of extinction high levels of anxiety and be prone to depression and other mood disorders. As depression is not an illness involving malfunction of one neurotransmitter alone, it is not a disease related to deficiencies in only one or two brain structures. It reflects, like many other mental disorders, a system failure. This system includes brain regions I discuss in this book, including the hippocampus, which has an important role in memory, and the striatum, which involves them in motor function, reward processing, and generating expectations of pleasure and pain, as well as other brain regions I focus on to a lesser degree, such as the thalamus and habenula. Abnormal activation of these regions and disruptive communication between them is often observed in depressed patients. It has been discovered, however, that to cure depression it is sometimes sufficient to target only one region. Changes in a single brain area can modify the function of other connected structures. The first day of spring. How can doctors alter the function of a target brain region? The answer is deep brain stimulation. I briefly mentioned this technique in Chapter 8. The technique is invasive. It involves implanting electrodes in the brain of the patient, then stimulating the brain tissue at a high frequency. The electrodes are connected to a small battery pack which is normally implanted close to the patient's collarbone. The system is controlled by an external device. It can be turned on or off to deliver electric stimulation. Deep brain stimulation is a well-known treatment for Parkinson's disease. For treating depression, however, it has been attempted only by a relatively small number of patients. Helen Mayberg, now at Emory University, pioneered the treatment together with her colleagues while working at the University of Toronto. She was attempting to treat severely depressed patients desperate for a cure. These patients had already tried a variety of treatment, psychotherapy, antidepressants, electroconvulsive therapy, without success. Mayberg's idea was to target the very brain region that consistently showed irregular function in depressed patients, the subgenual sigmoid cortex, which is a part of the ACC. As Mayberg herself testifies, she did not know what to expect. This area of the brain has never before been operated on such patients. Thankfully, what she was about to observe was much better than anything she dared hope for. Her first patient, a woman suffering from years of severe depression, was on the operating table. Her head was secured in a metal frame to keep it perfectly still, while the neurosurgeon drilled 2 narrow holes through her brain, one on each side. The patient was wide awake. She was aware of the fact that tiny foreign objects were about to be inserted into her brain. She could not feel a thing. During neurosurgery, it is important to have patients stay awake so that their cognitive motor functions can be monitored. The doctors had to make sure that the patient's speech was normal, that she could recognize their faces as well as move her fingers and toes. They also wanted to know what the patient was thinking and how she was feeling. The surgeon inserted an electrode through each hole to reach the white matter traces of the subgenual cingulate. When he administered a small current, that was a critical moment. Would stimulating the white matter tracks alter the patient's cognition? Would it change her mood? The team in the operating room turned silent in anticipation, and then nothing. The patient did not notice a thing, yet not all was lost. Each electrode had a few contacts in the brain. Although stimulating, the first contact did not result in noticeable changes. The second contact was the jackpot. The surgeon administered a moderate amount of current through the second contact. "Did you just do something?" asked the patient. I had this intense sense of calm or relief. It was just hard to describe. It's like the first day of spring, when the crocuses just pop up through the snow. This caught Mayberg's attention. "Wait a minute, are you saying crocuses?" she asked. No, I'm trying to think of something that invokes the kind of emotional state. This kind of calm and satisfaction. The patient responded. It was as if she realized the first day when you walk outside in spring and see the flowers. It's a sense of renewal. It's the start of spring. It was the most amazing and poetic statement, Mayberg recalled years later. Not all patients were as poetic as this one, but Mayberg would observe a change in emotional state in most. She could view this transformation in their expression. When the second contact was turned on, their faces would suddenly relax. The one patient described it as an ability to turn attention away from misery inside toward the people and events on the outside. Mayberg emphasizes that what her patients experienced was not a sensation of becoming happy, rather was one of regaining control. Before the operation, the emotional control system was, as Mayberg puts it, hijacked. After deep brain stimulation, it was released, and there was a state of calm and relief. There was something about this small amount of current in this that was very specific place that allows the system to re-equilibrate, she says. In Mayberg's patients, once an efficient interaction between monitoring frontal cortex and the subcortical emotional system was restored, their depression was cured, and Mayberg managed to help 2/3 of her patients, and the benefits were long-term. It is an interesting that when examining optimism, my colleagues and I found that activity in the area targeted by Mayberg was predicted by the degree of optimism in our subjects. You may recall that in the first brain imaging study on optimism, we saw enhanced connectivity between the ACC and the amygdala in healthy, optimistic individuals when they imagine positive future events, such as a sunny ferry ride, compared to negative events such as losing a wallet. So, whilst depression is associated with impaired connectivity between the ACC and the amygdala, and thus reduced ability for regulating emotions, as well as enhanced attention to the upsetting stimuli, optimism, on the other hand, is associated with enhanced connectivity between the ACC and the amygdala, leading to efficient emotion regulation and greater attention to positive stimuli. As you will remember, depression is also related to short alleles of the serotonin transporter. Is optimism related to long alleles of the serotonin transporter gene? Indeed, studies show that individuals with long versions of the allele tend to be optimistic. They score higher with optimism trait scale, report higher levels of satisfaction with life, and according to a study conducted at Essex University by the psychologist Elaine Fox, show a tendency to attend to the bright side. In her study, Fox presented participants with photos of either positive stimuli, such as someone smiling or ice cream, or negative stimuli, such as people frowning or an insect, alongside neutral photos. She found the attention of people with long alleles were captured more by the positive stimuli than the neutral stimuli, and less often negative stimuli. Fox concluded that this bias effectively protects people from clearly perceiving the negative aspects of life and enhances the tendency to perceive on the rosy side. This positive bias was not detected by participants with one or two short alleles. Our tendency for misery or ecstasy is partially determined by our genes. Yes, it is also related to our environment, but our health, to our unique experiences, as well as many other factors. It is a combination of all these that will ultimately trigger depression or protect us from us. End of chapter 6.